Super Rugby, folks, it's a bit of a soap opera in terms of some of the off-the-field stuff that goes on. If you haven't heard, in recent times there's been a bit of a stoush between the Aussies and the Kiwis about the future of the competition, especially with regards to revenue sharing. But revenue sharing is not the only item that's on the agenda. Apparently there are a number of points that both sides need to kind of hash out for the future of the competition. We'll go through a few of these now and you guys can let me know your thoughts. I should say it's not just Aussie rugby who's kind of pushing for change. Remember, I feel like a lot of the innovation stuff does get pushed from Australia because Australia is in direct competition with sports like NRL, AFL, and they kind of, I guess, want to increase their market share, and innovating seems to be one of the kind of roads that look to be taken, whereas in New Zealand, I don't think league or any other sports quite have that same threat to union. I mean, it's certainly a player participation thing at youth levels, but in terms of TV time, it's not the same situation in New Zealand from Australia. And I would imagine other countries where rugby is played, like the UK and Ireland and whatnot, it's maybe not quite the same. But yeah, we'll go through some of these points, and you guys can let me know your thoughts. A couple of these points are kind of linked in. One of them is a draft of young players to be signed by teams. One of them is a trade window where players could be traded between teams, and one of them is competition-wide eligibility, which means, keeping in mind that to play for the Wallabies, the All Blacks, you have to be based in Australia or New Zealand. I mean, Australia's got the exception for a couple of guys like Quade Cooper and Karevi and whatnot, but for the most part, you need to be based in country to be able to be eligible for the test teams. One of the ideas being bandied about is that you remove that, and as long as you're playing in Super Rugby, then you could still be eligible for either team no matter where you're based. So you could be, like, remember when James O'Connor was rumoured to go to the Chiefs a while back? Like, he could be at the Chiefs and still play for the Wallabies. You could have New Zealand young talent heading to Sydney to play for the Tars and still be eligible for the All Blacks. Now, I feel like that'd be a pretty big hurdle because in New Zealand especially, New Zealand rugby seems very hands-on and kind of keeping players in New Zealand, keeping them on whatever development path or playing them in whatever position they want them to be playing in, because it's all seen as a big kind of feeder for the All Blacks, right? And that's maybe one thing that some of these ideas are maybe trying to address, is that you need to give Super Rugby a bit more love and not just see it as kind of a feeder competition for the All Blacks where a lot of the money is made. So, these three things, like I said, kind of go hand in hand, because I think if you are going to have a draft, it probably needs to be competition-wide, and you probably need to be able to have those players being eligible for the All Blacks or the Wallabies no matter who drafts them. So, yeah, a draft is obviously, if you follow American sports, is pretty familiar. And they bandied the idea of a draft when Super Rugby Pacific was first kind of getting formulated. But it would essentially mean that the teams at the bottom of the log at the end of the season have first pick on young players who are kind of graduating from their academies into the first teams for the next season. So that's how it works in a lot of American sports, to try and keep a bit of parity amongst the teams so that the top teams don't get all the young players, basically, because it's obvious that talented youngsters, when they're leaving school, get attracted to more successful teams with better academies. That kind of goes hand in hand. You could see a draft as kind of punishing teams who don't rely on buying in players. They basically bring players through their own ranks. I mean, the Crusaders are a great example of churning through academy players and just unearthing talent after talent. But it's not just luck. That's a big operation. But I know from people telling in the comments before about the AFL. I'm not sure how big a deal the AFL draft is. You guys have to let us know. But the AFL has some system where if you're drafting players who went through your own academy, you kind of get like first dibs on them, or you at least get kind of like a discount at the draft. You're able to kind of like jump up a couple of draft spots if you're drafting someone who's from your own academy. So I guess there is a way to kind of get the best of both worlds. But yeah, the idea about a draft is, as I said, spreading the talent between different teams, and also, and it kind of goes into what I was talking about, like the keeping Super Rugby as a competition which gets a bit of love in terms of the marketing. Drafts are a big marketing opportunity, right? It gets the game in the headlines without actually having to have a game. Like, if you don't follow the American sports, you probably haven't seen it, but there's massive hype around who's going to go number one, and which team's going to get them, and if they pick this guy, then who's the other team going to pick? People do mock drafts. Like, it's a whole massive thing. And in terms of getting attention on Super Rugby, other than the game stuff, it would probably be a pretty That'd be an interesting one to see. But as I said, you guys who follow like the drafts of the AFL will have to let me know if that's kind of a big deal or not so much. Also, a trade window, and this also goes kind of hand in hand with wanting to keep more hype around the game. It's the ability to trade players. I know the Premier League is massive for it when they have kind of their transfer windows. Teams can buy and sell players to other clubs. I don't think rugby would be able to do the transfer fees thing because essentially rugby doesn't have that kind of money for clubs to buy players off other clubs. But certainly, like in some of the American sports, you could trade players to other teams. You can trade them for draft picks. You can trade them for player swaps. You can trade two young players for one kind of established star. All that kind of stuff. And again, it's more hype and it's maybe a little bit more flexibility because rugby, at least in Super Rugby, basically is you sign for a team. Your contract is usually not too long, like 1, 2, maybe 3 years. And basically when your contract runs out, you decide what you want to do with yourself. So there's not really much in the way of players leaving. I think the odd player gets their contract terminated early because they want to or because the team wants to. But there's not much in the way of player movements. Like Beauden Barrett leaving the Hurricanes to go to the Blues a couple of years ago was a massive story. And it kind of would be bigger if it was a trade. But whether this stuff definitely could transfer to rugby, I'm as in the dark as you guys would. But I know it certainly works in other sports. But just because it works in one doesn't necessarily mean it transfers to the other. So that's kind of some of the off-field stuff, which apparently Rugby Australia is pushing a few of them, like I said, with the whole innovations thing. And then also Sky New Zealand, the broadcaster, they got this guy, Justin Nelson, who is a real kind of marketing guru with sports and fan engagement. And he's going to be pushing for this kind of stuff because he's been quoted as saying like he wants the fans to be supporting the team throughout the year, even when there's not necessarily games on, whether it's trades or drafts or that kind of thing. You want to be engaged with your fans because he basically said that Super Rugby fans kind of go into hibernation, which is not what you want for engaged fans, right? You want them to be a fan year round. So yeah, those are some of the off the field things which have been bandied about by one party or another. And then there's a few kind of rule or law things that the Aussies in particular, I think, have been kind of pushing for. One of them is a scrum clock. So you'll have 60 seconds to set a scrum and get that sorted. I don't mind the idea of scrum clocks because I do think there's too much faffing about at kind of set piece stuff generally. Whether that would be implemented without kind of some safety concerns or other issues, I'm not sure, because I'm always very careful about when you change the laws of the game to see what the unintended consequences are, because there's always something. I know most of you guys probably don't follow the MLR, the American Rugby, which already has a draft, by the way, collegiate draft, but they put in a law for at least the last season, maybe the last 2 seasons, where if you score in goal directly behind the sticks, that's an automatic 7. The conversion doesn't need to be kicked. But I found from watching it, a lot of players, when they had the opportunity to score right in that 7-point zone, would put it just outside the 7-point zone, just right next to the line, to make sure their kicker has to take the conversion, because they want to get a breather. They want the breather. They want to have a wee rest. They want to have a wee chat. They don't want to get straight back into it. They want to have a wee rest. So yeah, just because you make the law doesn't always mean it's going to work that way, but I mean, scrum clock on paper anyway sounds like a decent idea. Reduced TMO, which is another one I'm kind of in favour of because I can't stand the constant stoppages and looking back and guys just standing around for 5 minutes getting their breath back. Not a huge fan of all the TMO. TMO was originally basically brought in to prevent howler decisions, guys who drop the ball over the line. And it's just kind of expanded in its use from there. There's kind of 2 camps on I want everything to be right or I want everything to be done quickly. Honestly, watching older games, I'm kind of in the camp of wanting everything to be done quickly, but everyone's in that camp, or at least some of us are in that camp until your own team gets robbed by something that could have been spotted by the TMO. But 2-stop-start rugby in general, and TMO I don't think adds to that. So again, on paper, looks like a decent one. And then deliberate knock-ons was also brought up as one that they would rather see that kind of thing not be something that should be yellow cardable. It should be maybe at worst a penalty because there's always that argument about deliberate knock-ons aren't really deliberate knock-ons anymore. It's just one-handed intercepts are not really allowed in certain circumstances. It's like even the term deliberate knock-on is not really appropriate for half the ones that get called deliberate knock-ons these days, right? So, yeah, there's a few things on the cards. Whether or not any of this gets across the line, I don't know, folks. Like I said, 2024 is still a big question mark for Super Rugby. How's the New Zealand and Australian relationship going to go? Could we even manage a draft on Super Rugby salaries? Like if you traded someone from like, I don't know, like Auckland to Perth, would they be happy to kind of uproot their family on a whatever, how many $100,000 player salary? They're going to have to rent a new house. Maybe their family got kids going to school back in Auckland. I don't know. There'd be a lot of considerations. Like that'd be a pretty massive shift. Likewise, the letting loose of the eligibility thing for, especially from a New Zealand perspective, because like I said, I feel like New Zealand rugby is pretty hands-on. Law variations, as I said, you kind of have to be careful with them as to what the unintended consequences might be. But having watched a bit of the State of Origin this year, I can see where they're coming from in wanting to speed the game up, because rugby league is certainly played at a lot higher pace than union. There's a lot of stoppages. But that being said, sometimes rugby union just needs to be rugby union and can't just be another version of rugby league, right? So, yeah, as I said, Australia is under a bit more pressure to innovate than I think some of the other places, but innovation's not always a bad thing. But yeah, we will see. You guys let me know your thoughts. Do you reckon a draft could work? Do you have any problems with drafts as a kind of thing? I remember last time we talked about drafts, someone said it gets a bit like egotistical. Guys get, very confident or like self-centered when they looking at the draft. But I follow the NHL, where the players are a bit more like rugby players. They're not so brash and outspoken, and they've got a draft, and I don't feel like those guys really kind of get too arrogant. I think they're kind of still pretty well-rounded, so it maybe speaks a bit more to the sport than just the draft. But anyway, you guys let me know your thoughts. How much of the stuff do you reckon could stick? How much of it's just kind of hot air? As I said, it's Australian rugby pushing for some of these things. Sky, the broadcaster here in New Zealand, is also pushing for some, and them and New Zealand rugby are kind of hand in hand. So we'll have to see what gets across the line. Take care, folks, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.